Today is Friday, April 10th, and this is VOA's International Edition. I'm Lori Lundin in Washington. Coming up, the coronavirus crisis continues to grip the world and the U.S., where New York continues to see the most cases and the most deaths.
We've lost over 7,000 lives to this crisis.
Experts around the world say the global economy is headed toward a very bad recession. Also ahead, secret talks are underway for a very big musical reunion by a wildly popular boy band. It's all on today's International Edition. As the coronavirus pandemic continues to spread around the world, the U.S. is close to 460,000 confirmed cases. A spike in deaths in Britain and New York, and surges of reported new infections in Japan and India's congested cities make it clear that the struggle is far from over. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, at his briefing Thursday, said that while they are beginning to flatten the curve, this is still a very painful time.
We lose 2,753 lives on 9/11. We've lost over 7,000 lives to this crisis. That is so shocking and painful and breathtaking.
In neighboring New Jersey, Governor Phil Murphy said the number of cases in his state also continue to rise.
We have received another 3,748 positive tests, 3,748 positive tests, pushing our statewide total to 51,027.
Murphy said despite what looks like a flattening of the curve, there are no plans to loosen restrictions on social distancing.
This isn't about you or me. It's about all 9 million of us. As we've said before, this is not a time for selfishness. This is a time for selflessness.
Meanwhile, a top U.S. military leader says the Navy aircraft carrier sidelined in the Pacific with more than 400 crew members infected with coronavirus is unlikely to be the only deployed ship affected by the outbreak. And General John Hyten, vice chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, also said Thursday that one sailor has been hospitalized in intensive care in Guam, where the USS Roosevelt has been docked for more than a week.
We're hoping that sailor recovers. We're praying for him and his family and his shipmates. But the Navy put together a good plan, especially given the challenges of putting 2,700 sailors into Guam.
The Navy, meanwhile, says the biggest problem is an inability to test enough people quickly, including those aboard the USS Nimitz, the next aircraft carrier due to deploy. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been moved out of intensive care. A spokesman says Johnson is back in a hospital ward where he'll continue to be closely monitored. He's been in intensive care for 3 days after his symptoms for coronavirus worsened. Johnson tested positive for the virus 2 weeks ago and at first only had mild symptoms. The global pandemic is taking a massive toll on the global economy. In the U.S., a staggering 16.8 million Americans have been thrown into the unemployment lines in just 3 weeks. AP correspondent Sagar Magani reports.
It's the biggest and fastest jobs collapse since record-keeping began 70 years ago. 16.8 million Americans filed for unemployment benefits the past 3 weeks. 1 in 10 workers have now lost their jobs since the crisis began. The numbers may be even worse. Unemployment offices are overwhelmed with claims, and layoffs are expected to continue, with businesses shut down and burning through any cash reserves. By month's end, some economists say the unemployment rate could hit a Great Depression-era level of 15%. Sagar Magani, Washington.
Well, the U.S. numbers underscore the terrifying speed with which the coronavirus outbreak has brought world economies to a near standstill. The head of the International Monetary Fund said Thursday the pandemic will push the global economy into the deepest recession since the Great Depression. International trade is forecast to fall between 13% and 32% this year and could be a worse drop since the global financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. The World Trade Organization this week said Wednesday the numbers will be ugly. The global economy, they say, could bounce back if countries work together instead of acting alone. Joining us now to talk more about these astounding numbers is Joel Paul, professor of international trade at UC Hastings Law School. What would a drop like this look like?
Well, the volume of world trade represents about 23% of the world's goods and services. So if you take the entire world economy, about 23% is trade in goods. And if you add in trade in services as well, things like financial services, tourism, transportation, airlines, you're probably talking about a little more than a third of the world's economy. And having a drop of as much as 32% in the volume of world trade is going to have an enormous impact on a number of countries, especially the European Union and many of the developing economies that rely on exports. And it'll have a somewhat less of an impact on the United States, but it will still be a significant impact on us. Trade represents about a little more than 20% of our gross domestic product. So it's not good.
How will it impact ordinary people in their, will we have more trouble getting things? Will things cost more? Will it just really wear down the economy? What do you see happening?
Great question. I think what we're going to see are sort of bumps in the global supply chain so that a particular factory that relies on getting widgets from Indonesia is not going to get the widgets from Indonesia that they need in a timely fashion. Mm-hmm. Or a factory that is producing cars that's exporting to another country is going to find that the market is going to be down. And so there are going to be potentially layoffs in some industries, and there's going to be shortages for some goods, for some consumers. It may be that the costs of German automobiles or Japanese automobiles will be higher for some Americans. And so you're going to see maybe Americans buying more U.S. automobiles, but then U.S. automobile producers produce some of their cars overseas, and they're going to have trouble getting them. So there's going to be shortages, twists in the supply chain that are going to make it difficult for producers and for consumers and possibly lead to higher prices. You don't know what we got till it's gone. I think many Americans who have been critical of globalization thought that imports were threatening American jobs are now going to find that American jobs are also dependent on imports and exports, and that the loss of that market is going to really hurt us.
Is this the worst case scenario projection if this thing isn't brought under control? Or is this likely what will happen, that international trade is forecast to fall up to 32%?
So the World Trade Organization is saying that if we don't coordinate our policies with other countries around the world, and if other countries don't adopt policies of people staying in place, sheltering in place, we're going to see a 32% decline in world trade. If we do adopt those policies, if we do coordinate, which we have not done to date, then they're projecting a decline in trade of 13%. Now, these are not very precise numbers, I have to tell you. I'm skeptical that they can make an accurate prediction because there's too many players, too many differences in policies. But I think the general point that the World Trade Organization is making is that we need to have international coordination. We need to coordinate how medical supplies are being produced and channeled and shared around the world. We need to provide aid to developing economies that may not have the means that we have to fight this pandemic. And unless those measures are undertaken, I think that their worst case projection is possibly going to come true, and it could be worse.
Well, and of course, it's such an unpredictable situation we're in, and we're also dependent on how all governments respond to the pandemic. There are a lot of moving parts here to how this all plays out. It's scary if their predictions are true that it could be worse than the Great Recession of 2008.
I think the central point that the World Trade Organization is making is that we have to address the pandemic as a health crisis first, not as an economic crisis. It's more important to get the pandemic under control than it is for people to go back to work. once we get the pandemic under control, we can then go back to work. If we instead go back to work too soon and the pandemic worsens, this crisis is going to go on, and it's going to be.
That's Joel Paul, professor of international trade at UC Hastings Law School. Thanks for being with us. Well, right before the pandemic, Greece was on a course to a promising rebound after a brutal 10-year financial crisis. Businesses and exports were slowly but consistently growing, and tourism was booming. With the coronavirus, however, the biggest money-making industry for one of Europe's weaker economies is now in peril. As Antti Karasava reports from Athens, tour operators and hoteliers are bracing for their worst season ever.
It was supposed to be a record year, with this tiny sun-kissed nation and its idyllic islands expecting 3 times as many travelers as its population of 11 million. Now not even a single tourist with a hat and camera can be seen. Lysandros Tsilidis, the president of the Federation of Hellenic Associations of Travel and Tourist Agencies, portrays a devastated tourist industry. From inexpensive hostels to 5-star resorts, he says, no one has been spared. Everyone is at zero. There is just no movement, nothing happening. Or trips have been cancelled, or flights have been grounded. It's impossible to predict how and when it could all start up again. For a country for which tourism accounts for 25% of gross domestic product, and where 1 in 5 jobs is linked to the trade, COVID-19 is exacting huge financial losses. The Greek economy is the European Union's second most reliant on tourism, after Cyprus, which makes it much more vulnerable and adds more hardship to a nation still reeling from a 10-year brutal recession. To offset some of the pain, Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis' government has weighed in, affording billions of euros to businesses while subsidizing employees' salaries to prevent massive layoffs. On the popular island of Rhodes, though, where more than 2 million mainly British, German, and American tourists flock each summer, resort owners are now considering staying shut beyond the mandatory lockdown that ends later this month. Manolis Markopoulos, the head of the island's hotel owners, say resorts may have no other option than to shut down entirely for the season. They say cancellations are running at nearly 100% for May, and operating costs are too high to maintain in a crisis that has no clear end date. Early and rigorous actions taken by the Greek government have helped contain the spread of the coronavirus here. However, for travel to resume and tourism to kick off again, all countries must be free of the coronavirus, Tsilidis says. Quarantines and travel just don't mix, he says. Which British national or German or American is going to travel halfway around the globe for a week's vacation in Greece, knowing he'll be quarantined for at least 14 days, he asks. To head off a complete collapse of the country's multi-billion-dollar industry, officials say they will target domestic tourism more than ever, encouraging Greeks to rediscover their homeland once the virus is brought under control and travel regulations ease. Tsilidis says, though, it may take as much as 18 months for foreign travelers to set foot here again in organized forms of travel. Normality, he says, can only resume when people feel it's safe to travel again. That, he says, can only come from health experts and the World Health Organization when they announce a cure or vaccine for the coronavirus. Antti Karasava for VOA News, Athens.
Here are some of the other top stories we are following. The number of Americans getting on airplanes has plunged to the lowest level in more than 60 years. One analyst estimates that air travel demand won't return to pre-outbreak levels until the middle of next year under the best of circumstances, and it's likely to be even later. At the holiest time of year for Christians, churches are wrestling with how to hold services amid the coronavirus outbreak and, in some cases, it has set up showdowns with local governments that have restrictions forbidding large gatherings. Former Vice President Joe Biden has unveiled plans to expand eligibility for Medicare and forgive college debt. The former vice president has begun courting progressives who lost their standard bearer, Bernie Sanders, this week, who dropped out of the race. Biden's swift move to shore up his support underscores the difficult choice many progressives were left with following Sanders' withdrawal: side with the more centrist Biden or keep up the fight and potentially lose the White House again. Stay with VOA for all the latest on the coronavirus pandemic.